A 9-year-old girl walks out of the frozen woods carrying something that was buried with a dead man 18 months ago. A military-grade GPS tracker, scratched, rusted, still attached to the keychain of a biker who never came home. The man who finds her hasn't spoken that name in over a year, because saying it out loud means admitting he stopped looking, admitting he let his brother die alone beneath a mountain. But the tracker is here, in a child's hand, which means someone down in that darkness has been breathing this whole time, and someone else has spent 18 months making sure nobody ever found out. Tonight, the dead start talking, and what they have to say will burn this town to the ground. If this story hits you in the chest, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay until the very end, because this one doesn't let go. Let's get into it. The first frost of October had already killed everything worth saving in Ash Ridge. Not the flowers. Not the gardens behind the boarded-up storefronts along Main Street. Those had died years ago, long before the mine closed, long before the unemployment office ran out of chairs and the last gas station replaced its pumps with plywood signs that said, "Closed until further notice." What the frost killed was the pretending. The thin membrane of normalcy that kept people saying good morning to each other at the post office. The careful way neighbors avoided mentioning the families who packed their trucks in the middle of the night and never came back. Ash Ridge wasn't a town anymore. It was a habit, a place people stayed because leaving required energy they'd already spent surviving. Jace Holloway rode through it the way he always did, slowly, with his visor cracked and the cold biting into the scar tissue along his jaw. The Harley's exhaust popped and rumbled against the empty buildings like a heartbeat in a morgue. He wasn't heading anywhere specific. He never was anymore. Tuesday nights meant a long ride through the back roads, past the old rail yard, up along the ridge where the tree line opened, and you could see the mountains turn black against whatever light the sky still held. It was the only time his hand stopped shaking, not from the cold, from everything underneath it. 3 tours. 2 explosions, 1 medical discharge that read, "Fit for civilian reintegration," while the VA counselor who signed it wouldn't make eye contact. Jace didn't talk about the tremors, didn't talk about the way certain sounds, a door slamming, a compressor kicking on, a child screaming in a grocery store, sent his pulse into a place where language stopped working and his body made decisions his brain couldn't authorize. He managed it. That was the word his last therapist had used before Jace stopped going. Managed. Like the thing living inside his nervous system was a budget spreadsheet and not a wound that reopened every time he closed his eyes. The road curved east past the old water tower. Jace leaned into it, feeling the bike settle beneath him, the tires gripping the frost-slicked asphalt with just enough traction to keep the metaphor from becoming literal. He thought about coffee. About the thermos sitting on the counter back at his trailer that he'd forgotten to fill. About whether Rooster had remembered to lock the clubhouse gate or left it open again like last Thursday when 2 raccoons got into the kitchen and knocked the industrial coffee maker off the shelf. Simple thoughts, safe thoughts, the kind that kept the other ones from surfacing. He almost missed her. The girl was standing at the edge of the tree line where County Road 9 dissolved into gravel and then into nothing. She was small, too small, wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves hanging past her fingers, the hood pulled up so only her eyes were visible. She wasn't crying, wasn't waving for help. She was just standing there, perfectly still, like something the forest had grown and then pushed out because it didn't want her anymore. Jace's boot hit the brake before his brain registered why. He killed the engine. The silence was immediate and enormous. Wind through dead branches. The distant hum of a transformer on a power line that served nobody. The girl didn't run. That bothered him more than anything. A child alone on a back road at 7:30 on a freezing October night. And she didn't flinch when a 6'2" man in a leather cut climbed off a motorcycle and walked toward her. Either she was too cold to be scared, or she'd already been through something that made a biker in the dark seem like the least dangerous thing she'd encountered tonight. "Hey," Jace stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see, far enough to not crowd her. "You lost?" She looked at him, not at his face, at the patches on his cut, the Iron Covenant emblem, the rocker underneath it read Ash Ridge. Her eyes moved across the leather like she was reading something written in a language she almost understood. No, she said. Her voice was steady, too steady. I know exactly where I am. Okay. Jace crouched down, one knee on the frozen gravel. The cold bit through his jeans immediately. Then where are you supposed to be? Home. Where's home? She pointed vaguely east toward the cluster of rental houses near the old elementary school. The ones with peeling paint and landlords who lived 3 counties away and never answered the phone. You walked all the way out here from Cedar Street? I walk everywhere. Jace studied her. 9, maybe 10, thin in a way that wasn't genetic, dark hair tangled and unwashed, fingernails dirty. Not neglected in the way that made people call authorities, neglected in the quiet way that slipped through every system designed to catch it, the kind of kid who ate school lunch like it was her only meal and never complained because complaining required believing someone was listening. He'd seen that look before, in a mirror, 25 years ago. It's freezing out here, he said. Let me give you a ride home. My mom says don't get in cars with strangers. Smart mom. She's not smart. She's just scared of everything. The honesty landed like a slap. Jace almost smiled. Almost. I'm Jace, he said. Now I'm not a stranger. That's not how it works. You're right. It's not. He pulled his phone from his jacket. You want me to call someone? The girl hesitated. For the first time, something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear, calculation. The fast survival-trained arithmetic of a child who'd learned to weigh every adult's intentions before revealing anything. Then she reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled something out. I found this, she said, in the tunnel. She held it up. A small device, rectangular, olive drab, attached to a rusted keychain by a loop of fraying paracord. Military spec. Waterproof housing. The kind of thing you'd miss entirely unless you knew what you were looking at. Jace knew what he was looking at. The ground tilted. Not physically, not the way it tilted during the episodes he didn't talk about. This was different. This was the specific vertigo of watching a locked door swing open in a room you'd bricked shut inside your own chest 18 months ago. He knew that tracker. He knew the scratch pattern on the left side of the casing. 3 parallel lines, a diagonal, 2 dots. Not damage. Code. Silas Boone's pre-mission marking system, carved into every piece of gear he carried so it could be identified if he couldn't be. Silas, who disappeared into the Black Ember mine on a rescue call that turned into a recovery operation that turned into a funeral without a body. Silas, who was the closest thing Jace had to a brother outside of blood. Silas, whose empty chair still sat at the clubhouse table because nobody could bring themselves to move it. Silas, who everyone agreed was dead. Where did you find this? Jace's voice came out wrong, too flat, too controlled. The voice he used when everything inside was screaming. The tunnel, past the old rail bridge, the one they boarded up. The girl watched him with those calculating eyes. There's a crack in the boards big enough to squeeze through if you're small enough. You went inside the mine? Not the mine. The tunnel before it. The one that goes sideways. Jace's hand was shaking again. Not the tremor. Something older. Something that felt like the moment before an IED detonated. When the air changed pressure and your body knew before your brain did. What's your name? He asked. Ember. Ember what? Quinn. Ember Quinn. He said it like he was filing it somewhere permanent. I need you to tell me exactly what you saw in that tunnel. She tilted her head. Why? Because the man who owned this... He stopped, swallowed. The cold air burned his throat. The man who carried this was my friend, and he's been missing for a very long time. Something changed in the girl's face. Not sympathy, recognition. The look of someone who understood what it meant to lose a person and have no proof they were gone. There were boot prints, she said quietly. Fresh ones. And food wrappers. and a generator that was humming, and doors. Doors? Metal ones. The kind with handles you push down. They didn't look old. Jace stood up. His knees cracked. The wind cut through his jacket, and he didn't feel it. He pulled out his phone and dialed. 2 rings. A voice like gravel being dragged across concrete. What? Rooster. I need you at the clubhouse. Now. It's Tuesday. I'm watching now. Silence. Then, how bad? Jace looked at the GPS tracker in the girl's hand, at the scratches that spelled a dead man's name in a language only 5 people on Earth could read. Get Dutch. Get Carvey. Get Bishop. Jace, how bad? Silas bad. The line went dead. Rooster didn't need more than that. Jace looked at Ember. She was watching him with an expression that made her look 30 years older than she was. Am I in trouble? She asked. No. Then why do you look like that? Like what? Like you just saw something die. He almost told her the truth, that he hadn't seen something die. He'd seen something come back to life, and in his experience, resurrection was always more dangerous than burial. Come on, he said instead. I'll walk you to the road. We'll figure out a ride. I don't need a ride. I need someone to believe me. The sentence hit him like a round to the vest. Center mass. No penetration. All impact. I believe you, Jace said. And he meant it in a way that went far beyond the tunnel. The Iron Covenant clubhouse sat at the end of a dead-end road behind a salvage yard that hadn't salvaged anything in a decade. The building was a converted machine shop, corrugated steel walls, concrete floor, a wood-burning stove in the corner that Rooster kept fed like it was a living thing he'd be judged for letting die. The overhead fluorescents buzzed at a frequency that made Jace's fillings ache. The coffee was always burnt. The chairs didn't match. The walls were covered in photos of men who'd ridden together, fought together, bled together, and in some cases been buried by the rest. Silas Boone's photo hung near the east window, black and white, taken during a charity ride 3 years ago. He was laughing in it, head thrown back, one hand on the handlebar, the other holding a paper cup of gas station coffee. It was the only photo anyone had where Silas looked like he wasn't carrying the weight of something invisible. Jace set the GPS tracker on the table beneath that photo. Nobody spoke for 11 seconds. He counted. Rooster leaned forward first. He was 56, barrel-chested, with a beard that had gone white 2 years before the rest of him caught up. His real name was David Loomis, but nobody had called him that since 1994. He picked up the tracker with fingers that were missing the tips of the left index and ring. Frostbite from a winter convoy in Kandahar that the Army classified as non-combat related, because admitting the truth would have required admitting the convoy shouldn't have been there. He turned the tracker over, saw the scratch marks. His jaw tightened so hard Jace heard his teeth click. That's his. Rooster said. I know. Where? Jace looked at Ember, who was sitting on a metal folding chair near the stove, holding a mug of hot chocolate that Dutch had made without being asked. Dutch was like that. 6'4", 260 pounds, full sleeve tattoos on both arms, and the first thing he did when a child walked into the room was check if she was warm enough and whether she'd eaten. Tell them what you told me, Jace said. Ember set the mug down carefully. She looked at the 4 men sitting around the table. Leather cuts, scars, calloused hands, eyes that had seen things they'd never fully describe, and she didn't flinch. There's a tunnel, she said. Past the old rail bridge on the north side of the mountain. The boards over the entrance are rotted out at the bottom. I've been going in there for weeks. I sketch abandoned places. She pulled a small notebook from her coat, flipped it open, handed it to Rooster. The pages were filled with pencil drawings. Detailed, precise, far beyond what you'd expect from a 9-year-old. Crumbling archways, rusted rail tracks, water-stained walls, and then, on the 6th page, something that made Rooster set the notebook down and look at Jace with an expression that said everything language couldn't. A drawing of a metal door, industrial, modern, installed in a wall of century-old stone. That doesn't belong in a collapsed mine, Carvey said from the corner. He was the youngest of the group, 31, lean, quiet, a former Navy corpsman who spoke in short declarative sentences and never repeated himself. That's recent construction. There was a generator behind it, Ember said. Diesel. I could smell it. And voices. Voices. Bishop straightened in his chair. He was the club's historian, the one who remembered everything, archived everything, connected everything. If Rooster was the muscle and Jace was the conscience, Bishop was the memory. How many? 2, maybe 3, men, speaking low. I couldn't hear the words. And the tracker? Jace asked. Where exactly? On the ground, in the tunnel before the door, half buried in dirt, like someone pushed it under the wall and hoped it would slide through to the other side. The room went quiet again. Every man in it understood what that meant. Silas hadn't lost the tracker. He'd hidden it. Deliberately placed it where only someone small enough, or curious enough, to explore the forgotten passages would find it. He'd sent a message, and it had taken 18 months for anyone to receive it. We call the sheriff, Bishop said. With what? Rooster didn't look up from the tracker. A kid's drawing and a piece of military hardware nobody outside this room can identify? Ed Rawlings has been sheriff for 12 years. You know how many times he's investigated anything past the county road? 0. He's a speed trap operator with a badge. Then state police. State police deferred to Rawlings on the original search. They signed off on the cave-in ruling. If we walk in now and say we think Silas is alive based on a GPS tracker a 9-year-old found while trespassing in a condemned mine, they'll laugh us out of the building and then flag us as persons of interest for entering a restricted area. Jace watched the argument the way he always did, from the edge, measuring temperature, waiting for the moment when positions hardened and someone needed to cut through. We don't call anyone, he said. Every head turned. Not yet. First, we verify. We go to the tunnel. We see what's there. If it's what Ember says it is, if there's a working facility inside that mountain, then we have something concrete, something that can't be dismissed. And if there are armed men inside, Carvey asked, then we'll know that too. Rooster set the tracker down, rubbed his face with both hands. The stove crackled and popped. Somewhere outside, a dog barked at nothing. This isn't a recon mission, Jace. This is personal. You haven't said his name out loud in 6 months. The words landed in the center of Jace's chest. He didn't deflect them. You're right, I haven't. Because every time I tried, I heard my own voice telling the club he was gone, telling his mother, telling his daughter, who was 4 years old and asked me if her daddy was coming home, and I said no. Jace's voice didn't crack. It went flat, surgical, the way it did when the emotions underneath were too large for the container he'd built for them. If there's a chance, any chance, that I was wrong, then I don't care if it's personal. I don't care if it's dangerous. I care that my friend might be alive under a mountain and I spent 18 months drinking coffee at this table instead of digging. Ember watched him from her chair by the stove. She hadn't touched her hot chocolate again. Her eyes were wide, but not frightened. She was watching a man break open in real time, and she recognized the architecture of it because she'd seen it before in smaller rooms with thinner walls. Dutch cleared his throat. The girl goes home first. I'm not going home, Ember said. You don't get a vote on this one, kid. I'm the only one who knows the way in. The sentence sat in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. She was right. None of them had been inside the tunnel. None of them knew which section was collapsed, which was passable, where the rotted boards were, where the new construction began. Ember had been navigating those passages alone for weeks. She was the map. No, Jay said. The word was absolute. You're going home. You're going to stay there. And you're going to tell no one about tonight. Why? Because the men inside that tunnel aren't the kind who let witnesses walk around. Ember's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened around the mug. Are they the kind who hurt people? Jace didn't answer. He didn't have to. My mom won't notice I'm gone, Ember said quietly. She works nights at the packing plant. She leaves at 6 and gets back at 4 in the morning. I eat dinner alone. I go to bed alone. I wake up alone. She looked at the photo of Silas on the wall. Is that the man? The one who owned the tracker? Yeah. He looks kind. He was. Is. You said if there's a chance. That means you think he's alive, so it's is. The correction hit Jace harder than anything else that night. Harder than the tracker. Harder than the scratch marks. A 9-year-old girl, alone in the world in every way that mattered, correcting his grammar because she understood something about hope that he'd forgotten. Dutch drove Ember home in his truck. She gave them her address, she gave them her phone number, a prepaid cell she'd bought herself with birthday money. She made Dutch promise to call her before they went to the tunnel. I won't promise that, Dutch said. Then I'll go back myself. You won't. Try me. Dutch looked in the rearview mirror at the girl sitting in the back seat with her sketchbook clutched to her chest like a shield. He didn't argue. He just drove. Back at the clubhouse, the 4 remaining men sat in silence around the tracker. The stove had burned down to embers. The coffee pot was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their tuneless song. Rooster spread a topographic map across the table. It was old, 1987, pulled from the county surveyor's office during the original search for Silas. The Black Ember mine complex was marked in red. 7 shafts, 3 ventilation tunnels, 2 emergency exits, all officially sealed after the mine closed in 2003. The collapse was here, Bishop said, tapping the northeast shaft. That's where the rescue team lost the signal. That's where they declared the search over. But Ember entered from the north side, Jace said, past the rail bridge. That's not the main shaft. That's... He traced his finger along the map. Ventilation Tunnel 4 was supposed to be completely collapsed. Supposed to be. If someone cleared it, if someone built inside it, they'd have access to the entire underground network without anyone on the surface knowing. Carvey leaned back. What are we saying? Someone's been operating a facility inside a condemned mine for years and nobody noticed? Look at this town, Rooster said. Nobody notices anything. Half the buildings on Main Street are empty. The sheriff's office runs a 2-man rotation. There's no cell coverage past the ridge. You could land a helicopter on the mountain, and the only witness would be a deer. That's the point, Jace said quietly. That's why they chose Ash Ridge. The realization settled over the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. Not just that someone was hiding inside the mountain, but that the entire town, its isolation, its poverty, its abandonment, was the camouflage. Ash Ridge wasn't collateral damage. It was infrastructure. Tomorrow night, Jace said, we go in. And if we don't come back? Carvey asked. Jace picked up the GPS tracker, turned it over in his hands, ran his thumb across the scratch marks that Silas had carved with a knife or a nail or whatever he'd had in the darkness, knowing that the message might never be read, knowing that hope was the most expensive currency a man could spend underground. Then someone will find this again, Jace said, and maybe they'll be braver than we were the first time. He pocketed the tracker. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The wind outside pushed against the walls like something trying to get in. And somewhere beneath a mountain that the world had already forgotten, in a darkness that had been engineered to last forever, a man who had been declared dead 18 months ago scratched another mark into a concrete wall. Day 547. Still breathing, still waiting. The marks on the wall were the only calendar he had left, and tonight, for the first time in all those days, something felt different. He couldn't explain it, just a shift. A vibration in the air that didn't match the rhythm of the generators, or the footsteps of the men who kept him locked behind steel doors they thought he couldn't breach. Something above him had changed. Someone had found the tracker. He pressed his back against the cold wall, closed his eyes, listened to his own heartbeat, the one sound they hadn't figured out how to take from him yet. And in the absolute blackness of 600 feet of rock and silence, Silas Boone allowed himself the most dangerous thing a prisoner can possess. He allowed himself to believe that the people he loved were coming. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that 3 hours before Jace Holloway found a girl on a frozen road holding the tracker he'd hidden with the last of his strength. 2 men in an unmarked sedan had parked outside the entrance to Ventilation Tunnel 4. They'd found the gap in the boards. They'd found the small footprints in the dust. and they'd already started looking for the child who made them. The unmarked sedan sat 200 yards from the tunnel entrance for 47 minutes before anyone inside it moved. The engine was off. The headlights were off. The only light came from the pale blue glow of a tablet screen held by the man in the passenger seat, a man whose face carried the particular blankness of someone who had been trained to process violence as data. He scrolled through images, thermal scans, topographic overlays, time-stamped photographs taken by a motion-activated camera hidden inside the tree line above ventilation tunnel 4. The photograph showed a small figure, hooded, entering through the gap in the boards at 4:17 p.m., exiting at 6:02 p.m., entering again 3 days later, and again, and again. 7 visits in 3 weeks, each one deeper, each one longer. The man in the driver's seat hadn't spoken since they parked. His name was Kessler. He was 44, ex-military, with a face like a closed fist and hands that rested on the steering wheel with the practiced stillness of someone who understood that patience was a weapon more reliable than anything holstered beneath his jacket. He watched the tree line the way a predator watches a game trail, not looking for movement, but cataloging its absence. "She took something," the passenger said. His name was Holt, younger, sharper jawline, eyes that moved too fast. Camera caught her with an object in her right hand on the last exit. Wasn't there on entry. What object? Can't tell from the angle. Small, rectangular. Kessler's jaw tightened by a fraction of a degree. Where does she live? Working on it. Town this size shouldn't take long. It shouldn't take anything. You should already have it. Holt didn't respond. He knew the difference between a reprimand and a conversation. This was the former. Kessler started the engine. The sedan pulled away from the shoulder without its headlights, rolling through the darkness like something that had never been there at all. Behind them, the boarded entrance to ventilation tunnel 4 stood silent beneath a sky packed with stars that nobody in Ash Ridge ever looked up to see anymore. 7 miles south, inside the Iron Covenant clubhouse, Jace Holloway hadn't moved from the table in over an hour. The topographic map was still spread in front of him, weighted at the corners by a coffee mug, an ashtray, a socket wrench, and the GPS tracker. He'd been staring at the map so long the contour lines had started to blur into each other, the elevation markings dissolving into meaningless numbers, the red mineshaft notations bleeding into the blue water table lines until the whole thing looked less like a map and more like a diagram of his own nervous system. Rooster sat across from him, smoking, not talking. The cigarette trembled slightly between his fingers. Not nerves, just the low-frequency tremor that lived in his hand since Kandahar, the one the VA said was consistent with peripheral neuropathy, and then prescribed a medication he couldn't afford and never filled. "You're not sleeping tonight," Rooster said. It wasn't a question. "No. You haven't slept in 3 days. I sleep. Sitting up in a chair with your boots on isn't sleeping, Jace. That's waiting for an ambush." Jace didn't answer. He traced the ventilation tunnel route on the map with his index finger. North entrance, lateral passage, connection to shaft 6. The lines on the paper were clean and precise, drawn by a surveyor in 1987 who probably never imagined that the geography he'd cataloged would become a burial ground or a prison, or whatever the mountain had become in the years since anyone bothered to look. "Tell me what you're not saying," Rooster said. "I'm not saying anything." "You've got that face. The one you had in Fallujah right before you told Briggs to change the convoy route, and he didn't listen, and 3 men came home in bags. Don't do that." "Do what?" "Use the dead to make a point." Rooster exhaled smoke through his nose. It hung in the air between them like a curtain neither of them wanted to pull aside. "I'm not using the dead. I'm using you, because you're sitting there building a plan in your head, and you haven't told any of us what it is. And the last time that happened, you ended up in a hospital in Landstuhl with a collapsed lung and a story that didn't match the incident report." Jace looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. The fluorescent light turned his skin the color of old newspaper. "You want to know the plan? The plan is we go to the tunnel. We see what's inside. We get proof. We come back. That's an objective, not a plan. Then it's an objective. And if there are people inside who don't want us there, then we'll deal with it. Deal with it. Rooster repeated the words like he was tasting something rotten. Jace, brother, I've known you for 19 years. I've watched you walk into rooms that would make grown men throw up. I've seen you carry a man a quarter mile through incoming fire without stopping. But I've also seen you chase ghosts until the ghosts won. And right now you've got that look. The one that says you've already decided the outcome and you're just waiting for reality to catch up. Silas is alive. Silas might be alive. That tracker might have been there for 18 months. The scratches might be old. The girl might have imagined half of what she saw. She drew it, Rooster. Industrial doors, generator housing, electrical conduit. A 9-year-old didn't imagine electrical conduit. I'm not saying she's lying. I'm saying we don't know what we don't know, and you're acting like we do. The stove crackled. A log shifted and sent a shower of sparks against the iron grate. Somewhere in the back of the building, a pipe clanked. The old plumbing protesting the cold the way it did every October. The building's own version of aging joints and failing cartilage. Jace pulled the tracker across the table, held it under the light. The scratch marks caught the fluorescent glare and threw tiny shadows across the olive drab housing. 3 lines. Diagonal, 2 dots, he said. That's Silas's pre-mission marker. You know that. I know that. He carved this before every operation. It's not random damage. It's identification. I'm not disputing the marker. Then what are you disputing? Rooster crushed his cigarette in the ashtray, leaned back. The chair groaned beneath him. I'm disputing you, your judgment. Right now, tonight, with no sleep and no plan and a dead man's ghost sitting in your chest telling you to run into the dark. The silence that followed was the kind that damages things. Not loud, not violent. The slow, pressurized silence of 2 men who loved each other enough to tell the truth and feared that the truth might be the thing that broke them apart. Jace stood up. The chair scraped against the concrete floor. He walked to the east window and looked at Silas's photograph on the wall, the laughing man, the paper cup of coffee, the hand on the handlebar, the moment frozen in time, the last image of a person before the world erased him. 18 months, Jace said without turning around. I wrote the eulogy. I stood in front of his mother and told her the mountain took him. I told his daughter, 4 years old, Rooster. I told her that her father was somewhere beautiful and he was watching her. His voice didn't break. It compressed, got denser, like metal being forged under heat that would destroy anything less stubborn. If he was down there the whole time, if he was alive while I was giving speeches about how brave he was, if he was scratching marks on a wall while I was learning to say his name in the past tense. He stopped. Not because he ran out of words, because the words that came next lived in a part of him he hadn't opened in years, and he wasn't sure the room could hold what was inside. Rooster watched him, said nothing. Let the silence do what silence does when 2 broken men stand on opposite sides of the same wound. We go tomorrow night, Jace said. All 5. Full gear, flashlights, radios. Carvey brings the medkit. Bishop maps our route in real time. We give ourselves 4 hours inside. If we haven't found anything by then, we come out and we call it. And the girl? She stays home. She won't. You know she won't. Then Dutch stays with her. Rooster was quiet for a long time. The stove popped. The wind pushed against the corrugated walls. The photograph of Silas watched them both from the wall with eyes that had no idea what was coming. Okay, Rooster said finally. Tomorrow night. He stood, pulled his jacket from the back of the chair, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Jace? Yeah. If he's alive down there and we bring him out, that's one ending. If he's not, and we find out what really happened, that's another. But the one I'm worried about is the third one, the one where we go in and we don't come back, and somebody has to stand in front of our families and give the same speech you gave for Silas. Jace didn't answer. Rooster walked out into the cold. His boots crunched on the frozen gravel. The door closed behind him with the sound of a coffin lid settling into place. Jace stayed at the window for a long time after that. He didn't look at the map. He didn't look at the tracker. He looked at the photograph of the man who used to sit in the empty chair, and he made a promise that he didn't say out loud because saying it would make it a debt, and he already owed more than he could carry. Morning came without permission. The light crawled across Ash Ridge like it was apologizing for existing. Gray sky, gray buildings, gray frost on gray streets. The only color in town was the red and yellow sign above Mabel's Diner on Route 11, and even that had faded to something closer to rust and mustard. Jace walked in at 6:40 a.m. He hadn't slept. His eyes felt like they'd been packed with sand and then set on fire. The coffee at the clubhouse had run out at 3 in the morning, and the nearest open gas station was 14 miles south. So he'd driven there on the Harley in the dark, bought 2 cups, drank them both in the parking lot, and then sat on the bike for 20 minutes listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching his breath crystallize in the headlight beam, trying to convince himself that what he was doing wasn't reckless. He failed. But he was doing it anyway. Mabel's was half full. The breakfast crowd, what remained of it, consisted of 4 retirees at the counter, a trucker in the corner booth reading a newspaper that was 3 days old, and Sheriff Ed Rawlings sitting by the window with a plate of eggs he wasn't eating. Jace saw Rawlings and kept walking toward the counter. He didn't sit. He ordered coffee to go and waited with his back to the room, which was a choice and not an accident. Holloway. Jace closed his eyes, opened them, turned around. Rawlings was beckoning with one hand. The other rested on the table near his coffee cup in a way that was supposed to look casual but read as territorial. He was 51, thick through the middle, with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild inconvenience, like the world existed specifically to interrupt his morning routine. Jace walked over, didn't sit. Heard some bikes last night, Rawlings said. Late? Your boys? We ride when we ride. That's not an answer. It wasn't a real question. Rawlings smiled the way people smile when they're calculating something. He pushed the plate of eggs aside and leaned back in the booth. I also heard something interesting. Linda Pruitt lives on Cedar Street, called the office this morning. Said she saw a motorcycle parked outside her neighbor's house around 8:30 last night. Big truck, too. Said a little girl was being walked to the door by a large man she didn't recognize. Jace's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes locked into place. The same mechanism that activated when a patrol walked into a zone that didn't feel right. The specific alertness that preceded either violence or survival, and often both. Linda Pruitt sees a lot of things, Jace said. Last month she called your office about a mountain lion in her garbage can. It was a raccoon. It was, but the motorcycle and the truck weren't raccoons, were they? I helped a kid who was lost on County Road 9, gave her a ride home. That a crime now? Rawlings picked up his coffee, sipped, set it down with the deliberateness that was meant to communicate control. It's not a crime, it's a pattern. Your club shows up places, things happen. Nothing illegal, I'll give you that, but things happen. And now you're helping lost children at 8:30 at night on a road that goes nowhere. It goes to the ridge. Nobody goes to the ridge. I do. Why? Because it's a road, and I have a motorcycle. And this is still a free country last time I checked, which was about 30 seconds ago. Rawlings stared at him. Jace stared back. The diner sounds filled the space between them, forks on plates, the coffee maker gurgling, Mabel's voice calling an order to the kitchen. Stay away from the mine area, Rawlings said. The whole north face is restricted. County order. Has been since the collapse. I know. Good. Then we understand each other. We understand each other perfectly, Sheriff. Jace took his coffee from the counter, walked out, didn't look back, but something about the exchange sat wrong in his stomach. Not the words, which were routine small-town authority flexing, but the timing. Linda Pruitt calls about a motorcycle at 8:30. Rawlings has the information by 6:40 the next morning. In a town where a domestic violence call takes 3 hours to generate a response and a burglary report sits on a desk for a week. Either Rawlings was an early riser who cared deeply about noise complaints, or someone had told him to ask. Jace sat on the Harley in Mabel's parking lot and drank his coffee and thought about that. The cold bit into his hands, his knuckles were white around the paper cup. A pickup truck rolled past on Route 11, its driver raising 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the automatic wave that people in small towns gave each other whether they meant it or not. He pulled out his phone. Dialed Dutch. "How's the girl?" "Dropped her off. Lights were off in the house. No car in the driveway. She went in through the back door with her own key." "Her mother?" "Night shift at the packing plant, like she said. Kids on her own until 4 a.m. Every night." Jace said nothing for a moment. The exhaust from the Harley condensed in the cold air and drifted sideways. "She ask anything else?" "She asked if she could come with us." "What did you tell her?" "I told her no. She said okay."
But the way she said okay was the same way. My daughter says okay when she means I'm going to do exactly what I want the second you stop watching. "Put Carvey on her." "What?" "Have Carvey do a drive-by tonight during the day. Check the house. Check the street. I want to know if anyone else has been watching her." Dutch was quiet. "You think they know?" "I think the sheriff knew about the motorcycle 8 hours before he should have. I think someone's paying attention to things that shouldn't matter. And I think a 9-year-old who's been walking in and out of a secret facility for 3 weeks is the kind of loose end that certain people don't leave untied. I'll call Carvey." "Dutch." "Yeah?" "She eats dinner alone every night. Make sure the fridge has food in it." The line went dead. Jace pocketed the phone, finished the coffee, crushed the cup, and shoved it in his jacket pocket because he'd never been the kind of man who littered, even when the world felt like it was littering itself across his entire existence. The afternoon passed the way. Afternoons pass when you're waiting for nightfall, and nightfall is the beginning of something you can't take back, slowly, every minute articulated, every hour a separate room you had to walk through before reaching the door at the end. Jace went back to his trailer. It sat on a half-acre lot behind the salvage yard, a single wide from 1998 with a roof that leaked in 3 places and a porch that had been rebuilt twice with lumber from different decades. The inside was clean, sparse, a man's space, reduced to essentials by the systematic elimination of anything that required emotional maintenance. Bed, table, 2 chairs. A shelf with 7 books, all of them about motorcycle mechanics. A photograph on the wall above the sink, Jace and Silas, arms around each other's shoulders, taken at a swap meet in 2019, both smiling, both looking directly at the camera with the unguarded openness of men who hadn't yet learned that the future was something to be afraid of. He showered, dressed, pulled the old Kevlar vest from the back of the closet, the one he'd bought at a surplus store 4 years ago and never worn because wearing it meant anticipating a situation where someone would be shooting at him. And admitting that anticipation meant admitting that peace was something he'd never actually achieved, just borrowed. He put it on. It fit differently than it had 4 years ago. His shoulders had gotten thinner. The straps needed tightening. He adjusted them in the bathroom mirror and caught his own eyes and saw something there he hadn't seen in a long time. Not courage, not determination, something more dangerous. Purpose. By 6 p.m., the clubhouse was full, not with people. With tension, the kind you could taste in the air like metal shavings. 5 men, 5 leather cuts, 5 sets of hands checking flashlights, testing radio frequencies, packing emergency supplies into saddlebags with the grim efficiency of people who'd done this before under worse conditions and survived not because they were lucky, but because they were stubborn enough to keep breathing when breathing stopped being easy. Carvey arrived last. He walked in and set his medkit on the table, a modified combat trauma bag he'd carried in the Navy and never fully unpacked, because unpacking it meant accepting that he'd never need it again, and his nervous system refused to believe that. "Drove past the girl's house twice," he said. "Once at noon, once at 4. "And?" "Sedan. Dark blue or black, parked on the cross street with a clear line of sight to her front door. 2 men inside, didn't move the whole time. The room went still." "Plates?" Rooster asked. "Out of state. Couldn't get the number without getting close, and getting close would have burned me." They're watching her, Bishop said quietly. He was standing by the map, a pencil behind his ear, a notebook open in his hands. They know she's been inside. They know she took something. They don't know she brought it to us, Jace said. Yet. They don't know yet. But a 9-year-old who explores tunnels for fun isn't exactly a master of counterintelligence. If they approach her, they won't approach her. Jace's voice dropped into the register that made the other men stop talking. Not anger, authority. The kind you earn in places where authority is the difference between everyone going home and no one going home. Dutch, you're staying behind tonight. Dutch looked up from the saddlebag he was packing. His hands stopped moving. I'm what? You're staying with the girl. Take a position on Cedar Street. Keep eyes on the sedan. If those men move toward that house, you make sure they don't get inside. Jace, I've been on every ride since the club formed. Every single one. And tonight you're protecting a 9-year-old who doesn't have anyone else. The two men stared at each other across the table. The overhead lights buzzed. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing dead leaves across the gravel lot in patterns that looked like something running. Dutch's jaw worked. His hands curled into fists on the tabletop. Then he looked at the photograph of Silas on the wall, the laughing man, the paper cup, and something in his chest deflated. Not defeat, acceptance. The specific acceptance of a man who understood that protecting the vulnerable was not a lesser mission than charging into the dark. If those men make a move, Dutch said, I'm not calling it in. I'm handling it. Handle it however you need to. Copy. Dutch picked up his jacket, walked to the door, stopped. Bring him home, Jace. That's the plan. Dutch left. His truck started in the parking lot. The headlights swept across the windows. Then he was gone. 4 men stood around the table. Jace, Rooster, Carvey, Bishop, the map, the tracker, the flashlights, the radios. Route, Bishop said. He traced the path on the map with a steady finger. North entrance, through the ventilation tunnel. The girl said the first 300 meters are collapsed but passable. Low ceiling, loose rock, single file. After that, the tunnel opens into what she called the wide room. That's where the old rail junction is. From there, the new construction starts. Metal doors, generator. The GPS tracker was found approximately 40 meters past the junction, pushed against the base of the western wall. Time in. 40 minutes to reach the junction if we move carefully. Call it another 20 to clear the wide room. After that, we're in unknown territory. Extraction? Same route out. No alternate. If it gets blocked, we're locked in. Comms? Radios won't penetrate that much rock. We're line of sight only once we're inside. I'll relay from the junction. Carvey stays within visual range of me. Jace and Rooster push forward. Jace nodded, picked up the GPS tracker, held it in his palm, felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the other weight, the accumulated mass of 18 months of grief and guilt and unanswered questions pressing down on a piece of military hardware that fit in the palm of his hand. Last chance, he said. Anyone walks away now, no judgment. Nobody moved. Nobody was ever going to move. They rode out at 8:47 p.m. 4 Harleys. Single file. No headlights until they reached the highway. The engines were the only sound in Ashridge, 4 heartbeats in a town that had forgotten how to pulse. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. The frost on the road glittered in the moonlight like broken glass. The trees along County Road 9 stood skeletal and black against the sky, their branches reaching upward in configurations that looked less like nature and more like the architecture of something pleading. They parked the bikes behind the old rail bridge, chained them to the steel framework, cut the engines simultaneously, a coordinated silence that descended like a held breath. Jay stood at the tree line and looked at the boards covering the entrance to Ventilation Tunnel 4. The gap was there, just as Ember had described. A section of rotted planking at the base pulled loose, wide enough for a child to slide through. An adult would have to crawl. He knelt, clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness beyond the boards and illuminated nothing. Just blackness. The kind that doesn't retreat when you shine light into it, but rather absorbs the light and asks for more. Going in, Jace said. He squeezed through the gap. The wood scraped against his Kevlar vest. The air on the other side was different. Colder, denser, carrying the mineral smell of wet rock and old iron and something else. Something chemical. Something that didn't belong in a century-old mine. Diesel. Faint but unmistakable. Ember was right. He pulled himself through. Stood. The ceiling was low, 5 feet, maybe 5'2". He had to hunch. The flashlight beam revealed a passage of rough-hewn rock, supported at intervals by timber frames that had bowed and cracked under decades of pressure. Water dripped from somewhere ahead, each drop echoing in a way that made the tunnel sound larger than it was. Rooster came through next, then Carvey, then Bishop, who immediately pulled a notebook from his jacket and began sketching the layout with a mechanical pencil, his hand moving with the same quiet precision that had mapped insurgent positions in Helmand Province 12 years ago. They moved forward, single file. Flashlights low, boots on wet rock, the sound of their breathing amplified by the stone walls until it became a rhythm. Inhale, step. Exhale, step. The cadence of men walking into something they couldn't walk out of the same way. 300 meters in, the tunnel changed. The old timber supports gave way to newer materials. Steel beams, poured concrete, electrical conduit running along the ceiling exactly as Ember had drawn. The diesel smell was stronger here, and underneath it, another smell, stale air pushed through mechanical ventilation. The kind of system you install when you're moving air into spaces that weren't designed to sustain human life. Bishop marked the transition point in his notebook, looked at Jace, held up the map, tapped the spot where ventilation tunnel 4 intersected with shaft 6. They were at the junction. The wide room. Jace killed his flashlight. The others followed. Total darkness, and in that darkness, sound, a generator. Low, mechanical, steady. Coming from somewhere below and to the left, and voices, not words. Just the vibration of human speech transmitted through rock and steel and concrete. The rhythm of conversation between people who had no idea that 4 men were standing 40 feet above them in a tunnel that wasn't supposed to exist. Jace reached into his pocket, pulled out the GPS tracker, ran his thumb across the scratch marks one more time. 3 lines, diagonal. 2 dots. Silas was down there, and in approximately 90 seconds, they were going to find out what 18 months of silence had been hiding. Rooster's hand landed on Jace's shoulder in the darkness, squeezed once, not a question, not permission, a promise. Jace stepped forward, into the black, into the unknown, into the belly of a mountain that had swallowed his brother and held him in its teeth for 547 days. There was no turning back now. There had never been. The darkness had weight, not metaphorical, physical. Jace could feel it pressing against his chest, his shoulders, the backs of his hands. 600 feet of granite and shale and fossilized silence stacked above them, like the accumulated grief of a mountain that had been hollowed out, used up, and left to collapse on whatever was still breathing inside it. He moved forward, one hand on the tunnel wall. The rock was wet and cold and vibrated faintly beneath his fingertips. The resonance of the generator somewhere below transmitted through stone the way a heartbeat transmits through a chest wall. His flashlight was off. All 4 flashlights were off. They moved by touch and sound and the particular instinct that combat veterans develop in their spines, the one that tells them whether the next step leads to solid ground or open air. The passage descended. Not steeply, maybe a 7-degree grade, but enough that Jace felt the shift in his knees, the forward pull of gravity encouraging him deeper. The diesel smell was thick now, mixed with something else, antiseptic, the clinical stripped-down smell of a space that had been cleaned with industrial solvents. Not a mine, not anymore. Something built inside a mine's carcass, something that breathed through ventilation ducts and hummed with electrical current, and existed in a place where no one would ever think to look.
Behind him, Rooster's breathing was measured and deliberate. The kind of breathing a man controls when his body wants to hyperventilate and his training won't let it. Carvey moved in silence, total professional silence, his feet landing on the rock with the precision of someone who'd been taught that sound was a liability before he was old enough to understand what liability meant. Bishop brought up the rear, his notebook closed, his pencil behind his ear, his hands free. The passage leveled out and opened into a space that Jace sensed before he saw it. The echo changed. The air moved differently. The walls fell away on both sides and the ceiling rose, and suddenly they were standing in something that wasn't a tunnel anymore. Jace clicked his flashlight on. Just for a second. Half a second. It was enough. The room was 30 feet wide and maybe 50 feet long. Concrete floor, poured, sealed, level. Not mine rock, construction. The walls had been reinforced with steel panels bolted to the stone, and the ceiling was crossed with I-beams supporting a network of conduit, ventilation ductwork, and fluorescent light fixtures that were currently off. 2 corridors branched from the far wall, heavy steel doors, industrial grade, the kind with electromagnetic locks and keycard readers. A 3rd door to the left was open, revealing a stairwell that descended into light. Actual light. Artificial, fluorescent, steady, coming from somewhere below. "Contact," Carvey whispered. Jace killed the flashlight, footsteps. Coming up the stairwell, one set, steady pace, not hurried. The sound of someone making a routine check, walking a route they'd walked 100 times before. The 4 men pressed against the walls, 2 on each side, flashlights off. Breathing controlled. The darkness was their only cover, and it wasn't enough. If whoever was coming reached the top of the stairs and turned on the overhead lights, 4 men in leather cuts standing against steel panels would be approximately as concealed as a grizzly bear in a bathtub. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A flashlight beam swept the room. It moved left to right in a lazy arc, the scan of someone who wasn't looking for intruders because intruders weren't part of the protocol. The beam passed within 3 feet of Rooster's boots, paused on the floor near the far corridor, and then swung back toward the stairwell. A radio crackled. A voice. Male. Bored.
Level 2 clear. Move into 3. A response, distorted by static. Copy. Kessler wants a count on the west storage. Says the inventory's off. Tell Kessler to count it himself. I'm telling you what he said. Fine. 20 minutes. The footsteps descended. The light faded. The radio noise dissolved into the stone. Jace exhaled. Rooster's hand found his arm in the darkness. Squeezed. The grip said everything a sentence couldn't. That name. Kessler. Filed and stored. They waited 60 seconds. Then Jace moved to the open stairwell door and looked down. The stairs descended 2 flights. The walls were painted concrete, gray, institutional, streaked with moisture. The fluorescent lights mounted to the ceiling cast a flat, shadowless light that made everything look like a photograph taken in a morgue. At the bottom of the 2nd flight, another corridor, this one longer, doors on both sides, some closed, some ajar. Through one of the open doors, Jace could see shelving, metal racks loaded with crates, boxes, equipment he couldn't identify from this distance. He took the stairs, slow, each step deliberate. His boots made almost no sound on the concrete. Years of walking quietly in places where noise meant death had turned silence into a muscle memory that activated without conscious thought. The corridor at the bottom was 60 feet long, 8 doors. The generator sound was louder here, coming from behind a closed door at the far end, marked with a yellow hazard sign, the universal symbol for high voltage. The antiseptic smell was stronger, and underneath it, something else, something biological, the faint, unmistakable scent of human habitation. Sweat, stale food. The particular odor of a space where people have been living in confined conditions for a long time. Carvey appeared beside him. His nostrils flared. His face changed. Not dramatically, not the way civilians' faces change when they encounter something disturbing, but with the subtle recalibration of a combat medic whose diagnostic instincts have just activated. That smell, Carvey said, barely audible. That's chronic wound care, betadine and necrotic tissue. You sure? Spent 2 years smelling it on a hospital ship. You don't forget. Jace moved down the corridor, checked the first open door, storage, crates marked with serial numbers and shipping codes. Nothing identifiable. The second door, locked. The third, another storage room. Smaller. This one had a desk, a laptop, paperwork spread across the surface. Jace didn't stop to read it. Not yet. The fourth door was different. It was steel. Heavier than the others. The lock was a deadbolt, not electronic, manual. The kind you install when you want to keep something inside rather than keep people out. A small observation window was set into the door at eye level, covered from the outside with a sliding panel. Jace slid the panel open. The room behind it was 10 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a cot, a bucket. A single fluorescent tube mounted behind a wire cage in the ceiling. The man on the cot was lying on his side, facing the wall. He was thin, much thinner than the man in the photograph at the clubhouse. His hair had grown past his shoulders, matted and unwashed. His left arm was wrapped in bandages that hadn't been changed in days, the fabric stained brown and yellow with the particular discoloration that Carvey had smelled from 30 feet away. His right hand rested on the concrete wall, fingers splayed, touching the surface the way a blind person touches a face, reading it, mapping it, maintaining contact with something solid, because everything else had become untrustworthy. The wall beneath his hand was covered in marks, hundreds of them, scratched into concrete with something sharp, tally marks, grouped in fives, row after row after row, covering the wall from the cot to the corner in a grid of accumulated days that looked less like a calendar and more like the inside of a mind that had been counting its own heartbeats to prove it was still alive. Jace's legs stopped working. Not his muscles, not his joints. The signal between his brain and his body simply severed, the way a circuit breaker trips when the current exceeds what the wiring can handle. He stood in front of that window and looked at the man on the cot, and the marks on the wall, and the bandaged arm, and the bucket and the cage over the light, and his entire chest filled with something so large and so hot that it displaced everything else: air, thought, language, the ability to process the difference between what he'd believed for 18 months and what was lying 6 feet away behind a locked steel door. Silas Boone was alive, and he was a prisoner. "Open it," Jace said. Rooster was already at the deadbolt. His hands moved fast. Too fast. The bolt was stiff. Corroded. He forced it with both hands, and something in the mechanism groaned, and then gave way, and the door swung inward. The sound woke Silas. He didn't startle the way a normal person startles. He came up off the cot in a single fluid motion, rolling to his feet, pressing his back against the far wall, one hand raised in front of his face, the other reaching for something that wasn't there. His eyes were open but not focused. The eyes of a man whose nervous system had been running on threat detection for so long that waking in combat readiness had become the same reflex. "Silas." Jace stepped into the room, hands visible, voice low, the way you approach a wounded animal or a man who's spent 18 months being conditioned to expect pain from every open door. "Silas, it's Jace." The eyes focused, slowly, like a camera lens adjusting to a light source it hadn't encountered in months. Silas's face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid they blurred together: confusion, disbelief, recognition, terror, and then something that wasn't any of those things. Something that didn't have a name because the human emotional vocabulary wasn't designed for the experience of seeing a brother's face after 547 days of darkness. "No," Silas said. The word stopped Jace like a bullet. "No, you can't be here." Silas pressed harder against the wall. His bandaged arm left a smear of fluid on the concrete. "You can't be here. They're watching. They're always watching. If they see you, we're getting you out. You don't understand. You don't understand what this is." "I understand enough. We found the tracker. The girl found it. We're here." Silas's face changed again. This time the expression stayed. Horror, pure,
distilled absolute horror. Not for himself. For them. The tracker was a mistake. I planted it too close. They found the camera footage. They know about the girl. His voice was hoarse, cracked and rebuilt and cracked again, the voice of a man who'd spent months alternating between screaming and silence. That's why you're here. They let you find me. The words entered Jace's bloodstream like ice water. What? This is a funnel. They knew someone would come. They pulled the perimeter cameras 3 days ago. They left the entrance boards loose. They wanted you underground. Silas grabbed Jace's arm with his unbandaged hand. The grip was skeletal but fierce. Kessler runs the security rotation. He's ex-Special Activities Division. He doesn't make mistakes. If you got in this easily, it's because he wanted you in. Rooster's face had gone the color of wet cement. He looked at Jace. Jace looked at Carvey. Carvey was already moving, not panicking, calculating, his body shifting into the combat medic's triage mode, where every problem gets assessed, prioritized, and addressed in order of lethality. How many? Carvey asked. Rotating crew, 8 to 12 on any given night. Armed, ex-military most of them. Kessler's the handler. He answers to someone I've never seen in person, only heard on the radio. Silas's eyes moved to the corridor. They're running a storage and transit operation. Equipment, weapons components, documents, things that move through here on their way to somewhere else. I stumbled into it during the rescue mission 18 months ago. They couldn't let me leave. They told the world you died in the collapse, Jace said. They caused the collapse, detonated charges in Shaft 6 to seal the main entrance and create a cover story. I was already down here. Already locked in. Silas's grip tightened on Jace's arm. They kept me alive because I saw the shipping manifests. They needed to know if I'd transmitted any information before they caught me. I hadn't, but they couldn't be sure, so they kept me. Interrogation. Months of it. Jace looked at the bandaged arm, at the tally marks on the wall, at the bucket in the corner, at the cage over the light. 18 months of this. 18 months of concrete and questions and pain while Jace sat in the clubhouse drinking coffee and learning to say his name in the past tense. Something inside him broke. Not the way glass breaks. Sudden, clean, final. The way a dam breaks. Slow at first, a crack, a seep. And then everything behind it rushing forward with a force that nothing can redirect. Can you walk? Jace asked. I can walk. Can you run? Don't know. Haven't tried in a while. You're about to try. Rooster was at the corridor door watching both directions. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed down. 3 people, lower level, moving upward. We go now, Rooster said. Jace pulled Silas off the wall. The man was lighter than he should have been, 70, maybe 80 pounds lighter than the laughing man in the photograph. His body was a record of deprivation written in the language of visible ribs and hollow cheeks and muscles that had atrophied to the point where standing was an act of will rather than physics. But he stood, and he moved. Because whatever they'd taken from him in 18 months, they hadn't taken the thing that made him Silas, the specific, unreasonable, medically inexplicable stubbornness that had carried him through 3 combat tours and a medical career built on the conviction that nobody dies on his watch if he has anything left to give. They made it to the stairwell. That was where it went wrong. The lights came on. All of them. Every fluorescent tube in the corridor, the stairwell, the room above. A flat, clinical, merciless light that erased every shadow and every advantage that darkness had provided. And then a voice, amplified, coming through speakers mounted in the ceiling that Jace hadn't noticed because they were painted the same gray as the concrete. Mr. Holloway. Jace stopped. The voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had been waiting for this moment and had rehearsed it the way a conductor rehearses the opening note of a symphony. Not because it needed rehearsal, but because precision was a form of pleasure. My name is Kessler. You and your men have entered a restricted facility without authorization. The exit you used to enter is now sealed. The ventilation tunnel has been locked at both ends. Your motorcycles have been identified and photographed.
Rooster's hand went to his hip. Instinct. There was nothing there. They hadn't brought weapons. The mission was recon, intelligence gathering, not combat. The distinction felt stupid now. A peacetime luxury applied to a wartime situation by men who should have known the difference. You have two options, the voice continued. Option 1. You leave Mr. Boone where you found him, walk back to the junction room, and wait for my team to escort you out. Your names and photographs will be added to our file. Any future attempt to contact law enforcement or media regarding this facility will result in consequences that I don't need to describe in detail. You're veterans. You understand the concept of escalation. Jace looked at Silas. Silas looked at him. In the space between their eyes, 18 months of silence condensed into a single, wordless exchange that carried more information than language could. Option 2, Kessler said. You attempt to leave with Mr. Boone, and my team responds accordingly. There are 12 men in this facility tonight, all armed, all experienced. The nearest law enforcement is 40 minutes away, and as you may have noticed, your friend Sheriff Rawlings has been cooperatively disinterested in activities on the North Face for some time now. The sentence landed like a detonation. Rawlings, the sheriff who knew about the motorcycle before he should have, the sheriff who warned Jace to stay away from the mine, the sheriff who had been cooperatively disinterested, not incompetent, complicit. The entire structure of what Jace understood about Ash Ridge rearranged itself in the space of 2 seconds. The town wasn't just camouflage, it was a managed environment, a pocket of controlled neglect maintained by a law enforcement officer who was either paid or coerced or both, ensuring that the mountain's secrets stayed buried under a layer of institutional indifference that looked, from the outside, exactly like the normal decay of a dying mining town. Rawlings, Jace said. Not to Kessler, to himself. Processing. Integrating. Sheriff Rawlings has been a reliable partner for 3 years, Kessler confirmed. His cooperation is comprehensive. Any report you file will be received by his office. Any investigation you request will be handled by his department. You are, as they say, inside a closed system. Bishop. Quiet, methodical Bishop. He'd been standing at the base of the stairwell with his notebook in his hand, and now he moved forward and whispered something in Jace's ear that the speakers couldn't pick up. The GPS tracker. Its memory chip. I cloned it at the clubhouse and left the copy with Dutch. If we don't come back by midnight, he transmits the data to the state police. Jace didn't react, didn't blink, didn't change his breathing. He let Bishop's words settle into the tactical part of his brain, the part that operated on probabilities and leverage and the cold arithmetic of negotiation under duress. Kessler, Jace said. His voice carried up the stairwell and into the speakers and through the stone walls of the facility like a signal flare. You've made a mistake. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when a man who's accustomed to controlling conversations encounters a sentence he didn't anticipate. The tracker your cameras saw the girl carry out. We didn't just bring it here. We copied it. The clone data is on the surface right now, in the hands of a man who has standing instructions to contact state law enforcement if we don't check in by midnight. No response. 5 seconds. 10. You can keep us down here, Jace continued. You can do whatever you plan to do, but the data goes out tonight regardless. Every GPS coordinate, every route fragment, every timestamp that proves this facility exists and that a missing persons tracker was transmitting from inside it. That goes to the state police, the FBI, media outlets in 3 cities. By morning, this mountain will have more cameras pointed at it than a presidential inauguration. The speaker crackled. A long exhale, barely audible, but there. You're bluffing, Kessler said. Am I? You pulled your perimeter cameras 3 days ago. You left the entrance accessible. You wanted us underground so you could control us. That means you didn't have eyes on our clubhouse. You don't know what we did with the tracker data between last night and tonight. You assume 4 bikers from a dying town wouldn't have the operational discipline to create a dead man's switch. Another silence. Longer. Jace could hear his own heartbeat in it, steady, controlled, slower than it should have been given the circumstances, because the adrenaline in his system had crossed the threshold where fear becomes clarity,
and every nerve ending in his body was operating at a frequency he hadn't accessed since the last time someone pointed a weapon at his chest. "You were Special Activities Division," Jace said, "so you know what a time-triggered contingency looks like. And you know that the only way to stop it is to let us walk out of this mountain with Silas Boone alive and intact. Because a dead man's switch only works while the dead man is still alive. And right now, Kessler, that's all 5 of us." Silas leaned against the stairwell wall. His breathing was ragged. His bandaged arm hung at his side. But his eyes, the eyes that had been unfocused and animal when the door opened, were locked on Jace with something that looked like the first light of a sunrise viewed from the bottom of a well. "You've got 60 seconds to open the exit route," Jace said. "After that, our man on the surface doesn't wait for midnight. He sends it immediately." The speaker went dead. 30 seconds of silence. Then the sound of electromagnetic locks disengaging, one after another. A sequence of heavy, mechanical clicks echoing through the corridor like a countdown in reverse. "Move," Jace said. They moved. Silas between Jace and Rooster, Carvey in front, Bishop behind, up the stairwell, through the junction room, into the ventilation tunnel. The boards at the entrance had been removed. The gap was now a full opening. Cold air rushed in. October air, freezing, sharp, carrying the smell of dead leaves and frost, and the particular metallic tang of freedom that only people who've been underground long enough to forget the sky can identify. They stepped out into the night. The moon was up. The trees were black. The frost on the ground reflected the moonlight in a field of white that stretched from the tunnel entrance to the tree line, like a carpet rolled out for men who'd earned the right to walk on it. Jace pulled Silas forward. The man's legs were failing. The adrenaline that had kept him upright in the tunnel was burning out, and what remained underneath was 18 months of malnutrition, muscle atrophy, infected wounds, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been surviving so long that his body has forgotten the difference between living and not dying. Rooster caught him from the other side. Together, they half carried, half walked him down the slope toward the rail bridge where the motorcycles waited. "They'll regroup," Carvey said, scanning the tree line. "Kessler's buying time. He's evacuating the facility and setting up an intercept. We have maybe 20 minutes before they come after us." "Then we have 20 minutes. They reached the bikes. Silas couldn't ride, couldn't grip the handlebars, couldn't hold himself upright on a seat. Carvey took him on the back of his Harley, securing him with a strap from the saddlebag, the combat medic's arms on either side of the skeletal man's body like the walls of a mobile fortress. 4 bikes, 4 engines. The sound erupted into the night like a declaration of war, not against an enemy, but against 18 months of silence that had tried to erase a man from the world, and failed because a 9-year-old girl had been curious enough to crawl through a gap in a rotted board and pick up something that didn't belong in the dirt. They rode. No headlights. Moonlight only. The frost-covered road unspooled beneath them like a ribbon of mercury. The trees blurred. The cold was absolute. A wall of freezing air that hit Jace's face and chest and hands with a force that felt less like weather and more like the mountain exhaling behind them, pushing them out, expelling them the way a body expels something it can no longer contain. Jace's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out with one hand, steering with the other, the bike leaning slightly as he glanced at the screen. Dutch. 1 message. 2 words. "They're here." The sedan. The men who'd been watching Ember's house. They were making their move. Jace opened the throttle. The Harley surged forward, the engine screaming in the frozen air, the sound carrying across the empty landscape of Ash Ridge like a warning to everything and everyone within earshot. They had Silas. But the people who'd kept him for 18 months now knew that a 9-year-old girl was the thread that had unraveled everything. And they were already at her door. Cedar Street was 6 minutes away at legal speed. Jace made it in 3. The Harley tore through Ash Ridge like a bullet through paper, past the darkened storefronts, past Mabel's diner with its lights off and its parking lot empty, past the sheriff's office where a single desk lamp glowed behind closed blinds,
and a man who'd sold his badge sat doing whatever compromised men do at 11 o'clock on a night when everything they've helped bury starts clawing its way back to the surface. Rooster was half a length behind him, Bishop farther back. Carvey rode last, one arm locked around Silas's chest, the other controlling the bike with the grim precision of a man who understood that the skeleton pressed against his back was simultaneously the most fragile and most important cargo he'd ever carried. Jace didn't call Dutch again. Calling required taking a hand off the handlebar, and at 93 miles per hour on frost-slicked residential streets, both hands were the difference between arriving and becoming a smear on someone's mailbox. Instead, he rode with the phone's single message burning in his mind like a brand pressed against the inside of his skull. They're here. 2 words, no details, no follow-up. Which meant Dutch was occupied. Which meant the situation on Cedar Street had already escalated past the point where a man had time to type a 3rd word. The houses on Cedar Street appeared through the tree line, small, worn, hunched against the cold like refugees who'd stopped expecting shelter. Porch lights off, windows dark. The particular stillness of a neighborhood where people went to bed early because staying awake required a reason and nobody had one, except at the 4th house from the corner. Jace saw the sedan first. Dark blue, almost black in the moonlight, parked at an angle across the narrow driveway with both doors open. The dome light was off. The engine was running. Exhaust vapor curled from the tailpipe in a thin white ribbon that the wind pulled apart before it reached the street. Dutch's truck was parked 30 yards east, tucked against the curb behind a dead oak. The driver's door was open. The cab was empty. Jace killed the engine, swung off the bike before it fully stopped, letting the Harley drop onto its side, on the frozen lawn with a crash he didn't hear because every acoustic channel in his brain had already been reallocated to threat assessment. He was moving toward the house before his boots fully registered the ground beneath them. The front door was closed, locked. He went around the side. The chain-link gate was open, not unlocked, broken. The latch had been forced, recent. The metal was still bright where it had sheared. The back door was open, not ajar. Open, wide. The kitchen light was on, throwing a rectangle of yellow light across the concrete step and the dead grass beyond it. Inside, the sound of something heavy being moved. A chair, a table, the scrape of furniture against linoleum. Jace stepped through the door. The kitchen was small and cluttered in the way that single-parent homes get cluttered when the parent works nights, and the child is old enough to feed herself, but not old enough to maintain the organized fiction of a functioning household. Dishes in the sink. A cereal box on the counter with the bag inside it rolled down and clipped with a binder clip. A child's drawing taped to the refrigerator. A sketch of a mountain with a tunnel entrance drawn in precise, confident lines. Dutch was standing in the center of the kitchen. He had a man pinned against the wall. Not with his hands, with his entire body. 260 pounds of bone and muscle and cold fury compressed against a man who was 6 inches shorter and 40 pounds lighter and whose feet were not touching the floor. Dutch's left hand was on the man's throat. His right held the man's wrist, twisted at an angle that was 3 degrees from dislocation. The man was Holt. Jace recognized the face from the description he'd never actually received, but somehow assembled from the accumulated details of the last 24 hours. Young, sharp jaw, eyes that moved too fast. Except the eyes weren't moving now. They were fixed on Dutch's face with the particular stillness of someone who has made a rapid and complete reassessment of the situation and arrived at a conclusion he doesn't like. "Where's the girl?" Jace said. Dutch didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Holt. "Bedroom. Door locked. She's okay. This one came through the back, found him in the hallway. The other one? Haven't seen him. The other one, Kessler." The name pulsed in Jace's skull like a radar ping. Well, Rooster came through the back door, took one look at the scene, moved past it without comment, heading toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. His boots were heavy on the linoleum. The house was small enough that every footstep sounded like a drumbeat. "Ember," Rooster called, not loud, firm. "It's Rooster, from the clubhouse. You met me last night. I had the white beard and the bad coffee." Silence. Then, from behind a closed door at the end of the hall,
You had hot chocolate. Dutch made it. That's right. Dutch made it. Dutch is here too. We're all here. I need you to open the door. A pause. The sound of a deadbolt turning. The door opened 3 inches. One eye appeared in the gap, dark, calculating, frightened in a way that she was working very hard to disguise. There was a man, she said. He came through the back. I heard the gate break. I know. Dutch handled it. Is there another one? Rooster looked at Jace. Jace looked at the dark house around them, the shadows in the corners, the windows with their cheap curtains pulled shut, the spaces between furniture where a grown man could wait in silence until the right moment arrived. Stay in the room, Jace said. Lock the door. Don't open it until you hear my voice. The door closed. The deadbolt turned. Jace moved through the house, room by room. The mother's bedroom, empty, bed unmade, nightstand cluttered with pill bottles, and a digital alarm clock that read 11:14 p.m. The bathroom, empty. Shower curtain pulled to one side, window closed and locked. The living room, empty. Couch against the wall. Television off. A basket of laundry that had been folded and never put away. No Kessler. He went back to the kitchen. Dutch still had Holt against the wall. The man's face had gone from pale to a shade of grayish purple that suggested Dutch's grip on his throat was more than symbolic. Where's your partner? Jace asked. Holt's mouth opened, closed. His eyes moved to the left, involuntary. The primal directional reflex that the body makes when the brain processes a location it doesn't want to reveal. Left, toward the front of the house, the street. Jace turned toward the front window, pulled the curtain aside 1 inch. The sedan was still in the driveway, doors still open, engine still running, but there was a second vehicle now, parked across the street. An SUV, black, running lights off, and standing beside it, illuminated only by the ambient glow of a distant streetlight, was a man in a dark jacket talking into a phone. Not Kessler, someone else. Someone new. How many of you are there? Jace asked Holt. Holt said nothing. Dutch adjusted his grip. The wrist rotated another degree. Something in the joint made a sound like a stick being bent. 4, Holt gasped. 4 total. 2 here. 2 en route from the mine. The mine's 40 minutes away. They left an hour ago. The math hit Jace like a fist. They'd left an hour ago. Before the bikers extracted Silas, before the confrontation in the stairwell, before Kessler's speech over the speakers. Kessler had dispatched men to Cedar Street before the bikers even entered the facility. He hadn't been reacting to the extraction. He'd been executing a parallel operation. Contain the bikers underground. Contain the girl above ground. Eliminate both loose ends simultaneously. The stairwell negotiation, the dead man's switch, the unlocked doors, none of it was capitulation. It was theater. Kessler had let them walk out because the real objective was never to keep them inside. It was to keep them busy while his team secured the one person whose testimony connected everything. A 9-year-old girl in a bedroom with a deadbolt that wouldn't stop a determined adult for more than 4 seconds. Rooster, Jace said. His voice was quiet, flat. The voice that everyone in the Iron Covenant recognized as the one that preceded action that couldn't be undone. Get her out of the bedroom. Get her to Carvey's bike. Now. Rooster moved. Jace turned to Dutch. Drop him. Dutch released Holt. The man slid down the wall and collapsed onto the linoleum, gasping, one hand at his throat, the other cradling his twisted wrist against his chest. Sit there, Jace said to Holt. Don't move. Don't call anyone. The man who just had you against the wall will be outside, and he has better hearing than you have judgment. He walked out the back door. The cold hit him like a slap. Not the gradual chill of riding through the night, but the immediate percussive cold of standing still in 27-degree air after a surge of adrenaline that had raised his body temperature to something approaching fever. Carvey was in the backyard. Silas was on the ground beside the bike, his back against the chain-link fence, his bandaged arm cradled in his lap. His eyes were closed, but his jaw was working. The unconscious grinding of a man in pain who has decided that pain is not a sufficient reason to make noise. How is he? Jace asked. Dehydrated, malnourished. The arm wound is infected. I'd guess 3, maybe 4 days without a dressing change. He needs a hospital. IV fluids, antibiotics, imaging on the arm. Probably surgery. Carve's voice was clinical, precise. The voice of a man who processed horror by converting it into medical terminology. He's conscious and oriented, but he's running on fumes. Another hour without intervention, and we're dealing with septic shock. He gets intervention, but not yet. Jace, not yet. There are at least 2 more hostiles incoming, maybe already here. I need you mobile. Carvey looked at Silas, looked at Jace. The conflict was visible in his face, the medic fighting the soldier, the instinct to treat fighting the instinct to protect. It lasted half a second. Then the soldier won, because in that moment, protecting meant treating, and treating meant making sure the area was secure enough to treat in. I need 10 minutes with him before we move, Carvey said. IV access, fluid bolus, something for the pain. You've got 5. Carvey was already opening the med kit. Rooster came through the back door with Ember. The girl was wearing the same oversized coat. Her sketchbook was clutched to her chest. Her eyes were dry but enormous, the eyes of a child who has been abruptly introduced to the idea that the world contains people who would come to her house in the dark to make her disappear, and that the only barrier between her and that disappearance is a group of scarred men in leather who showed up on motorcycles. She saw Silas on the ground, stopped. Is that him? She whispered. The man from the picture? Yeah, Jace said. He's skinny. He's been away a long time. Is he going to be okay? Jace looked at Silas. The matted hair, the bandaged arm, the visible ribs beneath the stained shirt, the face that had aged 15 years in 18 months. He looked at the tally marks he'd seen on the wall and imagined the hand that had scratched each one, counting days the way a drowning man counts breaths, holding on to the ritual of numbering time, because letting go of the numbers meant letting go of the belief that time would eventually deliver him somewhere other than that concrete room. He's going to be okay, Jace said, and meant it as a vow, not a prediction. Bishop appeared from the side of the house. His face was tight. 2 vehicles approaching from the south, moving slow. No headlights. How far? 90 seconds, maybe less. Jace calculated. 4 bikers, 1 injured man who couldn't walk, 1 child, 4 Harleys. A residential street with 1 way in and 1 way out. 2 hostile vehicles incoming. At least 2 more operatives in or near the property. And a sheriff who was, at this very moment, either sleeping through it or actively monitoring it from behind his desk lamp and his closed blinds. The math was bad. The math was always bad. The math had been bad in Fallujah and Helmand and every other place where the numbers said die and the men said no. Dutch. Truck. Now. Take Ember and Silas. Drive north on Route 11. Don't stop until you reach the State Police Barracks in Millhaven. That's 42 miles. Call them from the road. Tell them everything. Dutch didn't argue. He scooped Silas off the ground like the man weighed nothing, which he nearly did, and carried him around the house to the truck. Carvey followed, holding the IV bag above his head, the line running to Silas's arm, the medic jogging sideways to keep the connection intact. Ember didn't move. Go, Jace said. What about you? We'll be right behind you. That's what people say when they're not coming. The sentence hit him so hard he had to close his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the girl was staring at him with an expression that had no right to exist on a 9-year-old face. The expression of someone who had been lied to by every adult she'd ever trusted and had developed the ability to detect the structural integrity of a promise the way an engineer detects the structural integrity of a bridge. I am coming, Jace said. I promise. Promises break. Mine don't. She studied him for another half-second. Then she turned and ran around the house toward Dutch's truck. Her footsteps were light on the frozen ground. The footsteps of a child who had learned to move quietly, not because anyone taught her, but because quiet was the only form of safety her life had ever offered. The truck started. Headlights came on. It pulled away from the curb and accelerated north,
the taillights shrinking to red points that trembled in the cold air and then disappeared around the bend. 90 seconds are up, Bishop said. Jace looked at Rooster. Rooster looked at Bishop. 3 men, 3 bikes, a residential street about to become a choke point. We don't fight, Jace said. We delay. We block the street. We buy Dutch enough time to reach Route 11. Once he's on the highway, they can't catch a truck doing 90 without drawing attention they can't afford. And us? We scatter, 3 directions. Regroup at the old water tower on County Road 9. If they follow, then they follow one of us, not all 3, not the truck. Rooster pulled a cigarette from his jacket, lit it. The flame from the lighter illuminated his face for 1 second, the white beard, the deep lines around his eyes, the expression of a man who had been in this exact situation before in a different country and a different decade and had survived it not because of strategy, but because of the simple, brute force refusal to accept the premise that dying was mandatory. I'll take south, Rooster said. Draw them toward the highway entrance. Make noise. Bishop, east, through the rail yard. They can't follow bikes through the scrap rows. Copy. I go west, past the ridge, through the back roads. The 2 vehicles appeared at the south end of Cedar Street, moving slow, headlights still off. 2 dark shapes sliding through the darkness like predators entering a clearing. They stopped. 200 yards away, engines idling, waiting. Jace mounted his Harley. The engine caught on the first kick, a roar that shattered the silence of Cedar Street and announced to everyone within half a mile that something was happening that could not be ignored, could not be contained, could not be managed by men in dark sedans with phone calls to compromise sheriffs. Rooster's bike fired next, then Bishop's. 3 engines, 3 voices. The combined sound rattling windows in the dark houses, waking dogs, disturbing the careful quiet that Ash Ridge had wrapped around itself like a blanket to keep from seeing what was buried beneath it. The 2 vehicles began to move, accelerating. Jace looked south at the approaching headlights, looked north at the empty road where Dutch's truck had disappeared, calculated the distance, the time, the speed. Enough, barely, but enough. He revved the engine, revved. The Harley shook beneath him, the vibration traveling through the frame and into his hands and up his arms and into his chest where it met his heartbeat and synchronized with it, man and machine becoming a single system operating on the shared principle that stopping was not an option. Rooster peeled off first. South, directly toward the approaching vehicles. His headlight blazed to life, a single white beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. He didn't swerve, didn't hesitate. Rode straight at them with the specific insanity of a man who understood that the most terrifying thing in a confrontation is someone who doesn't act afraid, and the most effective distraction is a 240-pound man on an 1,100-pound motorcycle playing chicken with an SUV. The lead vehicle braked, swerved. Its tires screamed on the frost, and the rear end fishtailed across the center line. Rooster shot past it with inches to spare, the Harley's exhaust note dropping and then rising as he cleared the gap and opened the throttle on the straightaway beyond. The second vehicle hesitated, a fraction of a second. The driver's uncertainty, follow Rooster or continue to the house, created a gap. Bishop took it, east. Through the gap between the 2 vehicles, his bike leaning at an angle that put his knee within 6 inches of the asphalt, the engine screaming, the sound Dopplering past the SUV's open windows and carrying with it the specific message that the men inside had lost control of the situation, and every second they spent choosing a target was a second the real cargo got farther away. Jace went west, not through the gap, over the curb, across a lawn, through the gap between 2 houses that was barely wider than the handlebars. A fence appeared, chain link, 4 feet, and he stood on the pegs and lifted the front wheel and cleared it with a sound like a shopping cart hitting a wall. The backyard beyond was frozen mud and dead grass, and a children's swing set that he missed by the width of a prayer. Then he was on the parallel street, then the alley behind the hardware store, then County Road 6 heading west toward the ridge. His mirrors showed nothing behind him, No headlights, no pursuit. He checked the time. 11:31 p.m. Dutch had a 9-minute head start. In 9 minutes at highway speed, the truck would be 15 miles north. 15 miles closer to the state police barracks in Millhaven. 15 miles closer to a jurisdiction that Ed Rawlings couldn't contaminate. Jace Road. The cold was beyond feeling now. It had passed through the stages of discomfort and pain and numbness and arrived at something that was almost meditative. A blank, white, absolute cold that stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the essential machinery of survival. Hands on grips, eyes on road, engine beneath, wind ahead. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Dutch. On Route 11, moving fast, girls in the back with Silas. Carvey's keeping him stable. No pursuit. Jace exhaled. The breath crystallized in front of his face and was torn away by the wind. Millhaven Barracks. Don't stop. Already called ahead. State police dispatchers expecting us. I told them officer involved corruption in Ashridge. Missing person recovered alive from an illegal facility. Child witness in protective custody. They're sending units south. How many? She said 4 cars, plus a detective unit. ETA? She said 30 minutes to the barracks, 45 to Ashridge. 45 minutes. Jace held the number in his mind like a burning coal. 45 minutes until jurisdiction shifted. 45 minutes until Kessler's closed system cracked open. 45 minutes until the managed neglect that had kept a man imprisoned under a mountain for a year and a half met the first external force capable of dismantling it, if the evidence held, if the GPS data was intact, if Silas could testify, if the state police acted before Kessler sanitized the facility and disappeared into whatever network had placed him there. If Jace reached the old water tower on County Road 9 at 11:47 p.m. Bishop was already there, his bike parked behind the concrete base, his body pressed against the tower's rusted steel leg, his breath visible in short white bursts. "You okay?" Jace asked. Clipped a guardrail on the turn past the rail yard, scraped the saddlebag. Bike's fine. I'm fine. They waited. 3 minutes, 5, 7. Jace's chest tightened with each passing minute. Rooster had gone south, directly toward the 2 vehicles, the most dangerous route, the distraction play, the one designed to absorb maximum attention and maximum risks so that everyone else could get clear. The one Rooster had volunteered for without hesitation because that was who Rooster was. A man who walked toward the thing that everyone else ran from. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because his fear had never once in 56 years been sufficient reason to let someone else take the hit. 9 minutes. Then, sound. Distant. The unmistakable low-frequency rumble of a Harley engine at high RPM, coming from the south, getting louder. A single headlight appeared on County Road 9, wobbling slightly, moving fast. Rooster pulled up to the water tower and killed the engine. He sat on the bike for a long moment without moving. Then he pulled off his gloves and Jace saw that his hands were shaking. Not the Kandahar tremor, something else. Adrenaline aftershock. The involuntary response of a nervous system that had just processed a near-death experience and was now presenting the invoice. "They followed me for 2 miles, Rooster said. His voice was steady but thin. SUV, fast. Better driver than I expected. I took the switchbacks above the quarry. He couldn't make the turns." "Did he see your face?" "Doesn't matter. He'll know the bike. He'll know the cut." Rooster looked at Jace. His eyes were wet. Not crying, just the physiological response to 40-degree air hitting corneas at high speed for 11 consecutive minutes. "Dutch?" "On Route 11, 15 miles north. State police are rolling." Rooster closed his eyes, opened them, looked up at the water tower, at the sky beyond it, at the stars that burned above Ashridge with the cold indifference of objects that had been watching this town destroy itself for decades, and would continue watching long after every person in it was gone. "We did it," he said. "Not yet. Not until Silas is in a hospital and the state police are inside that mine. We got him out, Jace. We got him out of the ground." The words landed in Jace's chest and stayed there. He didn't respond. Couldn't. because the space between getting Silas out of the ground and getting Silas safe was still filled with 45 minutes of uncertainty, and a network of armed men who had just lost their most valuable prisoner and their most protected secret on the same night. His phone buzzed again. Dutch. Jace, problem. The word dropped through Jace's stomach like a stone through water. What? Roadblock. Route 11, 2 miles south of the barracks. Ash Ridge Sheriff's cruiser, lights on, blocking both lanes. Rawlings, the man had driven north, gotten ahead of the truck, set up a checkpoint on the only road to Millhaven, the closed system. Even with state police coming, Rawlings still had a badge, still had authority, still had the legal power to detain a vehicle and its occupants long enough for Kessler's people to arrive and make everything and everyone inside that truck disappear into the same silence that had swallowed Silas 18 months ago. Don't stop, Jace said. Jace, he's a sheriff. He's got lights on. If I run a roadblock set up by law enforcement... He's not law enforcement. He's a prison guard who let a man rot under a mountain for 18 months. Don't stop. Drive through. Silence on the line. 2 seconds. 3. Then Dutch's voice, low and hard, and carrying the weight of a decision that would define everything that came after it. Copy. The line went dead. Jace stood at the base of the water tower and stared at the phone in his hand and waited for the next call that would tell him whether the people he loved were alive or arrested or worse. The wind pushed against him. The stars burned. The night held its breath. And somewhere on Route 11, a truck carrying a dying man, a 9-year-old girl, and the truth about what lay beneath the mountain of ash ridge accelerated toward a wall of flashing lights that represented the last barrier between 18 months of darkness and the first morning that might finally break clean. Dutch didn't slow down. The truck hit 87 miles per hour on the straightaway south of the Millhaven barracks, the engine screaming in a register that no factory-stock pickup was designed to sustain. The headlights cutting 2 white corridors through the darkness that ended at the flashing blue and red wall of Sheriff Ed Rawlings' cruiser, parked diagonally across both lanes of Route 11. In the back seat, Carvey pressed Silas flat against the bench and covered the man's body with his own. Ember was on the floor behind the passenger seat, wedged into the space between the seat frame and the door panel, her sketchbook still clutched against her chest, her eyes closed, her lips moving without sound, counting maybe, or simply repeating something to herself that she needed to believe was true. Dutch saw the cruiser, saw the lights, saw the silhouette of Rawlings standing beside the driver's door with one hand raised and the other resting on his holstered sidearm, the posture of a man who expected the vehicle approaching him to stop because vehicles had always stopped for him, because the badge on his chest and the lights on his roof had always been sufficient to enforce the particular version of order that he'd been paid to maintain. Dutch aimed for the gap between the cruiser's rear bumper and the guardrail. It was narrow, 3 feet, maybe 3.5. The truck's mirrors wouldn't clear. The passenger side would scrape. The impact would be loud and violent and would either push the cruiser far enough to widen the gap or catch the truck's front quarter panel and spin both vehicles into the ditch. He didn't care. The man in the back seat had spent 18 months in a concrete box because this sheriff had agreed to look the other way. The girl on the floor had been targeted for elimination because this sheriff's cooperation had allowed a criminal operation to function without oversight. Every day Silas had scratched into that wall, every meal Ember had eaten alone, every lie Rawlings had told or tolerated or silently endorsed, all of it was compressed into the 30 yards of asphalt between the truck's front bumper and the gap that shouldn't have been wide enough but was going to be, because Dutch was going to make it be. Rawlings saw the truck wasn't stopping. His hand came off the holster. Both hands went up. He scrambled backward, not toward cover, just away, the instinctive retreat of a man who had miscalculated the resolve of the people he'd assumed he could control. The truck hit the gap at 71 miles per hour. Metal screamed. The passenger mirror exploded. The right side of the truck carved a 6-foot gash along the cruiser's rear quarter panel, spinning the lighter vehicle counterclockwise on the frost-slicked road. Glass from the cruiser's taillight sprayed across the asphalt like red confetti. The truck shuddered, fishtailed, caught traction, and kept going. In the rear-view mirror, Dutch saw the cruiser come to rest sideways across the southbound lane. Saw Rawlings standing in the road with his hands at his sides, watching the truck's taillights disappear north. Saw the man reach for his radio and then stop. Just stop. His arm falling back to his side like a rope going slack. Because there was no one left to call. No system left to activate. The closed loop was broken, and the man who'd maintained it for 3 years was standing alone on a 2-lane highway in the middle of the night with a wrecked cruiser and the knowledge that everything he'd helped bury was now traveling at 70 miles per hour toward people he couldn't influence. Dutch picked up the phone. "Jace, we're through." At the base of the water tower on County Road 9, Jace Holloway closed his eyes. He didn't say anything, didn't pump his fist, didn't exhale with relief. He just stood there with the phone pressed against his ear and his eyes closed and the wind pulling at his jacket, and he let the sentence pass through him the way a current passes through a wire, entering at one end, traveling the full length of everything he was, and exiting on the other side, having changed the fundamental charge of every cell it touched. Through. They were through. "Barracks in 3 minutes," Dutch said. "I can see the lights. Stay on the line until you're inside." "Copy." Jace listened. The sound of the truck engine, the sound of tires on highway, the faint sound of Carvey's voice in the background, talking to Silas, keeping him conscious, keeping him present, the medic's clinical monotone serving as an anchor for a man who had been drifting in and out of a darkness that had nothing to do with the mountain above him and everything to do with what 18 months of captivity had done to the architecture of his mind. Then voices, new voices, authoritative, the sound of car doors opening, radio chatter. "State police," Dutch said. 4 units, they're coming to the truck." Jace opened his eyes. "Tell them everything. Start with the mine. Give them the GPS data. Give them Silas. Give them the girl." "What about Rawlings?" "He's on Route 11 with a wrecked cruiser and nowhere to go. They'll find him." "And Kessler?" "The mine. He'll be sanitizing the facility. Every minute they wait is evidence they lose." Dutch relayed the information. Jace heard it transmitted, the specific cadence of urgent operational communication being absorbed by people who had the training and the jurisdiction and the legal authority to act on it. He heard the words "missing person" and "child witness" and "illegal facility" and "officer corruption" spoken by Dutch in a voice that carried 18 months of accumulated outrage compressed into sentences short enough for dispatchers to transcribe. Then Dutch again, closer to the phone. "They're taking Silas to Millhaven General. Ambulance is already here. Carvey's going with him. The girl—" A pause. "They want to call her mother. Her mother's at the packing plant. Night shift. Doesn't get off until 4. I told them. They're sending a unit to the plant." "Dutch." "Yeah?" "Stay with Ember until her mother gets there. Don't leave her alone." Silence. Then Dutch's voice, softer than Jace had ever heard it. The voice of a man who weighed 260 pounds and could pin a grown man against a wall with one hand, speaking with the specific tenderness that only the truly strong are capable of because they're the only ones who can afford to be gentle without it being mistaken for weakness. "I'm not going anywhere." The line stayed open. Jace didn't hang up. He stood at the water tower and listened to the sounds of the Millhaven barracks, engines, radios, doors, voices, and he felt the night shift around him. Not the temperature, not the wind, the night itself. Changing, turning, the specific moment when darkness reaches its deepest point and begins, almost imperceptibly, to thin. Rooster was leaning against his bike, smoking. The cigarette's ember was the only warm color in the landscape, a tiny orange point that pulsed with each inhale like a signal fire built for an audience of one. "It's done?" Rooster asked. "It started. The done part takes longer." Rooster nodded. He understood. The extraction was complete. The testimony was in motion. But the machinery of accountability moves slowly, and the space between rescue and resolution is filled with depositions and evidence processing and legal proceedings that stretch across weeks and months and require the specific patience of people who've learned that justice doesn't arrive on a motorcycle at 90 miles per hour. It arrives in a courtroom, in a file, in a sentence spoken by a judge after a process that feels nothing like the urgency that initiated it. They rode back to the clubhouse at a speed that respected the frost and the hour, and the fact that their bodies had been running on adrenaline for 6 consecutive hours and were now presenting the bill. Jace's hands ached. His back was a single continuous knot from the base of his skull to his tailbone. His eyes burned with the gritty sandpaper fatigue of a man who hadn't slept in over 40 hours and was now operating on the thin, brittle energy that the human body manufactures when all other reserves are depleted. The last resort fuel that keeps the machine running but charges compound interest on every minute of borrowed function. The clubhouse was cold when they arrived. The stove had burned down to white ash. The fluorescent lights buzzed their tuneless hymn. The coffee pot sat empty on the counter, and the topographic map was still spread across the table, weighted at the corners by objects that now felt like relics from a different era: the ashtray, the socket wrench, the coffee mug. The GPS tracker was gone. Bishop had it. He'd already handed it to the state police along with the cloned data and a written summary of everything the Iron Covenant had documented over the past 36 hours. Bishop's report was 7 pages long, handwritten in the precise block lettering he'd used for field intelligence in Helmand Province, each fact numbered, each timeline entry cross-referenced, each name spelled correctly. The state police detective who received it would later describe it as the most organized civilian witness statement he'd encountered in 22 years of service. Jace sat in his chair. Rooster sat in his. Bishop sat in his. The fourth chair, Silas's chair, remained empty. But its emptiness had changed. It was no longer the vacancy left by a man who was gone. It was the space held for a man who was coming back. Nobody spoke for a long time. The ash in the stove settled with a sound like whispered conversation. The wind outside had died. The silence that replaced it was not the tense, pressurized silence of the past 2 days, but something older and more fundamental. The silence that follows the breaking of a storm, when the air clears and the ground is still wet, and the world has the particular stillness of a thing that has survived what it was not certain it could survive. Rooster crushed his cigarette, lit another, looked at the photograph of Silas on the wall. "I owe him an apology," he said. "For what?" "For believing the cave-in, for accepting it, for not going back." "We all accepted it. I was the senior man. I should have questioned it harder, should have pushed back on the sheriff's report, should have doesn't live here," Jace said. "Not tonight." Rooster looked at him. The old man's eyes were red-rimmed and wet, and this time it wasn't the wind. It was the specific moisture that accumulates when a person who has trained himself not to cry encounters a grief too large for his training to contain. He was down there, Jace, for 547 days, in a box, and I was up here, drinking coffee, telling stories about him like he was already a memory. So was I. That doesn't make it better. No, it doesn't. But it makes it shared. And shared weight is the only kind that doesn't break you. Rooster didn't answer. He smoked. He looked at the photograph. And slowly, in the way that healing begins, not with a dramatic gesture, but with the quiet, almost invisible decision to stop holding something that was never yours to hold, his shoulders dropped 1/4 of an inch, and his jaw unclenched, and his breathing shifted from the controlled, measured rhythm of a man managing his interior to the slower, deeper rhythm of a man allowing it. The hours passed. At 2:30 a.m., Bishop's phone rang. The state police had reached the mine. The entrance to Ventilation Tunnel 4 had been partially sealed, fresh concrete poured over the gap in the boards, still wet when the officers arrived. But the concrete hadn't cured, and the tunnel beyond it was intact. The officers entered with a tactical team and found the facility exactly as the bikers had described it. The steel doors, the generator, the corridors, the storage rooms. Most of the equipment had been removed. The crates were gone. The laptop was gone. The paperwork was gone. But they found the cell. They found the cot, the bucket, the fluorescent tube behind the wire cage, and the wall. The wall with its 547 tally marks scratched into concrete by a man who refused to let his days pass uncounted because counting them was the last act of agency available to him, the final proof that he existed in time. And that time, eventually, would deliver him somewhere other than where he was. The state police photographer documented every mark. Each one would become evidence. Each one represented a day that a man had been held against his will while a sheriff 2 miles away cashed checks and answered phone calls and maintained the specific brand of willful ignorance that allows evil to operate in plain sight. At 3:15 a.m., Rawlings was arrested at his home. He was sitting in his kitchen when the officers arrived. The coffee maker was on. His badge was on the table. He didn't resist, didn't speak. He stood up, turned around, and placed his hands behind his back with the practiced compliance of a man who had spent 12 years putting handcuffs on other people and understood the mechanics from both sides. He would later plead guilty to multiple charges. His testimony would implicate Kessler and 6 other individuals in the operation. The network that had used the mountain as a transit point for weapons components and classified documents would be dismantled over the following months in a series of federal investigations that would never make national news because the people involved were the kind of people who could ensure that their exposure remained local and their names remained redacted. Kessler was apprehended 3 days later at a motel in a town 90 miles south. He was carrying 2 passports, a laptop with an encrypted hard drive, and $11,000 in cash. He did not go quietly. The arrest required 4 officers and resulted in minor injuries to 2 of them. In custody, he said nothing. He would continue to say nothing throughout his trial, his sentencing, and his transport to a federal facility where the silence he'd weaponized against Silas would become the only environment available to him for the next 23 years. Holt cooperated, gave names, gave routes, gave dates. His testimony would prove essential to the federal case and would earn him a reduced sentence that he would serve in a minimum security facility where the food was better than anything Silas had eaten in 18 months, and the irony of that disparity would not be lost on anyone who followed the proceedings. But all of that was later, weeks later, months later, the slow machinery of justice turning at its own speed, indifferent to the urgency that had started it. In the immediate aftermath, in the hours between the extraction and the dawn, there was only the clubhouse, the stove, the empty coffee pot. 3 men in leather cuts sitting in the silence of a room that had been the headquarters of their grief for 18 months and was now slowly becoming something else. Dawn came at 6:47 a.m. Jace watched it through the east window. The light didn't arrive dramatically. No golden sunrise. No cinematic breakthrough of color through clouds. Just a gradual, gray, honest lightening of the sky that turned the mountains from black to charcoal to the deep blue-green of pine forests emerging from darkness. The frost on the gravel parking lot caught the first light and held it, transforming the ground into a field of tiny reflections that looked, from the right angle, like a constellation that had fallen to earth and was waiting to be picked up. His phone rang. Carvey. He's stable. IV antibiotics, fluid resuscitation. The arm wound needed debridement. Infection was deep but contained. Surgeon says he keeps the arm. Full function with rehab. Is he conscious? In and out. Lucid when he's up. Asked about the club. Asked about his daughter. Jace's throat tightened. He swallowed against it. Tell him we're coming. Jace, he asked about you specifically. He said... Carvey paused. The medic, who could describe compound fractures and septic shock without inflection, found something in Silas's words that disrupted his clinical composure. He said, I knew Jace wouldn't stop. That's what he said. I knew he wouldn't stop. Jace put the phone down. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He looked at the wood grain, at the coffee rings, at the scratches and burns and accumulated damage of years of men sitting at this table making decisions that ranged from the mundane to the life-altering, and he breathed. Just breathed. Because Silas was wrong. Jace had stopped. For 18 months he had stopped. He had accepted the cave-in, accepted the funeral, accepted the empty chair. He had stopped looking because looking hurt, and stopping was easier. And the story the world told him, that Silas was gone, that the mountain had taken him,
that grief was the appropriate response, was a story that required less of him than the truth. The truth required digging. The truth required doubt. The truth required a man to look at the official version of events and say, "This isn't enough, and I won't stop until I know." A 9-year-old girl had done that, not Jace, not Rooster, not any of the men who wore the Iron Covenant patch and called themselves brothers. A child who ate dinner alone and explored abandoned places because nobody was watching her and nobody cared where she went had done the thing that grown men trained in combat and hardened by loss had failed to do. She had remained curious, and her curiosity had saved a man's life. Jace rode to Millhaven General at 8 o'clock that morning. The highway was clear. The roadblock was gone. Rawlings's cruiser had been towed. The only evidence of the night's events was a 6-foot scrape of blue paint on the guardrail where Dutch's truck had grazed the cruiser, and even that would be gone after the next rain. The hospital was a 3-story building on the north edge of Millhaven, surrounded by a parking lot that was already filling with the morning shift. Jace parked the Harley near the entrance. The engine ticked as it cooled. The sound was familiar. The mechanical heartbeat that followed every ride, the machine's way of transitioning from motion to stillness. He'd heard it 10,000 times, but this morning it sounded different, gentler, like an exhale after a breath held too long. Dutch's truck was in the lot. So was a state police cruiser, and a small car that Jace didn't recognize. A 10-year-old sedan with a dented fender and a child's car seat visible through the rear window. Inside, he found Dutch in the waiting area on the second floor. The big man was sitting in a plastic chair that was 3 sizes too small for him, his leather cut draped over the back, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked exhausted. The deep-bone exhaustion of a man who had driven through a police roadblock, delivered a dying man and a frightened child to safety, and then sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours because he'd promised not to leave. "Her mom's here," Dutch said. "Got in about an hour ago. She's in with Ember now." "How is she, the mom?" "Angry, scared, confused. The kind of confused that happens when you find out your kid's been exploring condemned tunnels for a month and nobody told you because nobody knew." Dutch sipped the cold coffee. Grimaced. "She also hugged me. Twice. Called me an angel. I told her I was definitely not that." Jace almost smiled. "Silas?" "Room 214. Carvey's still with him." Jace walked down the corridor. The fluorescent lights here were the same frequency as the ones in the clubhouse, the same tuneless hum, the same flat white light. But they felt different. Hospital fluorescents illuminate healing. Clubhouse fluorescents illuminate waiting. The distinction was not in the wattage, but in the context. And context, Jace had learned, was the difference between enduring something and surviving it. Room 214. Door half open. Carvey sat in a chair beside the bed, a medical chart in his hands, his eyes scanning it with the fluency of a man who could read vital signs the way other people read newspapers. He looked up when Jace entered, nodded once, stood, walked to the door. "He's awake," Carvey said quietly. "Vitals are improving. He's tracking, coherent, oriented to time and place. The malnutrition is significant. Refeeding protocol will take weeks. The arm's post-op and stable. The psychological component..." He paused. "That's going to take longer than the arm." "I know." "I mean years, Jace, not months." "I know." Carvey looked at him. The medic's face held an expression that was rare for him. Not clinical, not tactical, but something fundamentally human. The expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life treating wounds and has just encountered one that no skill set in his possession can fully address. "He's tough," Carvey said. "Toughest I've seen. But tough breaks, too. Just differently." He left the room. Jace stepped in. Silas was propped up in the hospital bed. IV lines in both arms. Monitors beeping the slow, steady rhythm of a heart that had been beating in darkness for a year and a half and was now beating in light and hadn't yet adjusted to the difference. His face was gaunt, the bones visible beneath the skin in a way that made him look like a sketch of himself, a preliminary drawing that hadn't been finished.
His hair had been cut by a nurse sometime during the night. His bandaged arm rested on a pillow beside him, but his eyes were open. And when they found Jace in the doorway, they changed, not dramatically, just a shift in the light behind them, the particular luminance that appears when a person who has been alone for a very long time sees a face they were afraid they'd never see again. "You look terrible," Silas said. "You should talk." "I lost weight." "You lost your mind going into that mine alone." "It was a rescue call. Someone reported a hiker missing in the upper shafts." I responded. "There was no hiker." "No, there wasn't. They needed someone with medical training underground, someone whose disappearance could be explained by a cave-in." Silas's voice was hoarse but steady, the voice of a man who had spent 18 months having conversations in his head and was now, finally, having them out loud. "They didn't choose me at random, Jace. They chose me because I was the one who'd go in alone. Because that's who I am, the one who goes in." Jace sat in the chair Carvey had vacated. The vinyl was still warm. "Not anymore. From now on, nobody goes in alone." Silas looked at him, a long look, the kind that passes between people who share a history dense enough to make language feel like a reduction rather than an expression. "The girl," Silas said, "the one who found the tracker, is she safe?" "She's here, down the hall, with her mother." "I need to see her." "You need to rest." "I need to see her, Jace. I left that tracker in the dirt and I told myself someone would find it. I told myself that every day. Every one of those 547 days, someone will find it, someone will come. But I didn't think it would be a kid. I thought it would be a hiker, a surveyor, someone official." His eyes glistened. "A 9-year-old girl crawling through a gap that I couldn't fit through, finding the thing I'd hidden because she was small enough and curious enough and brave enough to go where nobody else went. She draws abandoned buildings. That's why she was in the tunnel. She draws them. Sketches. Detailed. Professional quality. She draws the things everyone else forgets." Silas closed his eyes. When he opened them, the moisture had spilled over and was tracking down his hollow cheeks in 2 thin lines that he didn't wipe away because wiping them would have been a denial of what they represented, and he was done denying things. "Bring her," he said. "Please." Jace went to the waiting area, found Ember sitting beside her mother, a thin woman in her mid-30s with dark circles under her eyes and hands that hadn't stopped moving since she arrived, straightening Ember's hair, adjusting her coat, touching her shoulder, her arm, her face, the compulsive physical inventory of a parent who has just learned that her child was in danger and needs to verify, repeatedly and through touch, that the child is still intact. "Ember," Jace said, "someone wants to meet you." The girl looked at her mother. Her mother looked at Jace. The woman's eyes were red and wary and held the complex calculation of a parent assessing a stranger who had both endangered and saved her child in the same 24-hour period. "It's the man from the mountain," Jace said. "He's asking for her." The mother's expression shifted. She looked at Ember. Ember looked at her. "Go," the mother said. "I'll be right here." Ember stood, followed Jace down the corridor. Her footsteps were quiet on the linoleum. She still carried the sketchbook. At the door of room 214, she stopped, looked in, saw the man in the bed. She didn't speak. She walked to the bedside and looked at Silas the way she'd looked at the tunnel entrance on the first day she'd found it, with the careful, measuring gaze of someone cataloging something she intended to remember. "You left it for me," she said. "The tracker. You pushed it under the wall. I left it for whoever would find it. I found it. You did." "Why did you write, 'Don't leave her alone'?" Silas looked at her, at this small, serious person standing beside his bed with a sketchbook pressed against her chest like armor. "Because I was alone," he said, "for a very long time, and the one thing I learned is that being alone is the one thing nobody should have to be." Ember studied him. Then she opened her sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, sat down on the floor beside the bed, cross-legged, and began to draw. Silas watched her for a moment. Then he looked at Jace,
who stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed, his eyes burning with exhaustion, and something else, something that lived deeper than fatigue and would outlast it. "She's drawing me," Silas said. "She draws the things everyone else forgets." Nobody's going to forget this. No, nobody is. 3 weeks later, the town of Ash Ridge held a gathering at the old mining memorial on the North Ridge. Not a ceremony, not an event, a gathering. The distinction mattered. Ceremonies had agendas and speeches and programs printed on cardstock. This had coffee and paper cups and people standing in the cold because they'd been asked to come and had decided that coming was more important than knowing why. The memorial had been neglected for years. A granite marker with a bronze plaque listing the names of miners killed in the 1987 collapse, surrounded by a chain-link fence and a gravel path that led nowhere. The Iron Covenant had cleaned it up. Rooster replaced the fence posts. Bishop repainted the plaque. Carvey cleared the brush. Dutch built a bench. Jace added one thing, a small glass case mounted beside the plaque, and inside it, the GPS tracker. Olive drab, scratched. The paracord loop frayed. The battery still dead. Beside it, a brass plate with a single sentence. The smallest discovery can uncover the greatest hidden truth. Ember stood at the front of the gathering with her sketchbook. She didn't make a speech. She showed a drawing. She'd done it the week before, sitting on the floor of Silas's hospital room while he slept. A pencil sketch of the tunnel entrance, the gap in the boards, the passage beyond. But in the drawing, the passage wasn't dark. It was filled with light, coming not from the outside but from somewhere deeper, somewhere underneath, as if the mountain itself had been holding a lantern and had finally been given permission to lift it. People looked at the drawing and didn't say much. They didn't need to. The drawing said what drawings say when words are too small and silence is too large, and the space between them can only be filled by something a 9-year-old puts on paper because she hasn't yet learned that the world doesn't work the way she draws it. After the gathering, the bikers rode. Not fast, not with purpose, just rode. 5 bikes now. Jace, Rooster, Carvey, Bishop, and Silas, who had been cleared for light riding 3 days earlier and who sat on his Harley for the first time in 18 months with his hands on the grips and his eyes on the road and his body remembering what his mind had never forgotten, the specific sensation of forward motion, of wind and engine, and the road unspooling beneath you like a promise that the next mile will be different from the last. They rode past the diner, past the salvage yard, past the clubhouse with its corrugated walls and its buzzing lights and its table with 5 chairs that were, for the first time in 18 months, all occupied during the same week. They rode up County Road 9, past the water tower, along the ridge where the tree line opened, and the mountains spread out beneath the evening sky in a cascade of green and gray and deep purple shadow. The sun was going down. The light was the color of copper and old honey, and it touched the tops of the trees and the surface of the road and the leather on the bikers' backs with the particular warmth that October gives as an apology for everything it's about to take away. Jace rode at the front, Silas beside him, the others behind. At the top of the ridge, Jace slowed, stopped, killed the engine. The others stopped beside him, 5 bikes, 5 men. The sound of the engines dying was replaced by the sound of wind and the distant call of a bird and the specific enormous silence of a landscape that has been witness to terrible things and beautiful things and has not chosen sides because landscapes don't choose sides. They simply hold whatever is placed upon them and wait. Jace looked at the mountains, at the sky, at the road behind them and the road ahead. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Beside the road, a quarter-mile back, a small figure stood at the edge of the gravel shoulder. Ember Quinn, sketchbook in hand, coat still 2 sizes too big, her mother's car parked behind her, engine running, the silhouette of a woman in the driver's seat who was learning, slowly, imperfectly, the way all parents learn, to let her daughter stand at the edge of things and draw what she saw. Ember watched the bikers on the ridge. 5 figures against the evening sky. She opened her sketchbook. found a clean page. This time, she didn't draw abandoned tunnels or crumbling archways or the dark spaces that nobody else visited. She drew 5 men on motorcycles, stopped at the top of a hill, looking out at a world that had tried to erase one of them and failed because the others refused to let it. She drew them the way she drew everything, precisely, carefully, with the attention of someone who understood that the things worth remembering are the things most people walk past without seeing.
And at the bottom of the page, in her careful 9-year-old handwriting, she wrote a single line that nobody asked for and everyone needed. They went into the dark so everyone else could find the light. The wind turned the page. She held it down, kept drawing. The bikers started their engines. The sound rolled across the ridge and down the mountain and through the streets of Ash Ridge, where people looked up from their kitchens and their porches and their quiet, diminished lives, and heard, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, something that sounded less like noise and more like a heartbeat returning to a body that had forgotten it had one.